Buckle up, Buttercup, because the GNOME Foundation is just about out of money. They could be bankrupt within the year. Yeah, the biggest Linux desktop on Earth could be just about plumb out of cash. And the plan to fix it apparently involves a shaman and sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. This is real. This story just broke by the Lunduke Journal, naturally, just a couple hours ago. I'm going to read the article to you now. There's a ton of details in here. I went through a lot of paperwork to get this all figured out, and I have some additional things to say as well. It's no secret that many open source organizations struggle to fund themselves, with the GNOME Foundation being one of the on more of a shoestring budget than you would expect for a project as widely used as GNOME. Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE Linux Enterprise, Ubuntu. It seems like every major professional enterprise-y Linux distribution uses GNOME. It's a pretty big deal. But to make matters worse, the GNOME Foundation has been paying for most of their expenses, not a little bit, but most, by draining their savings account, as they spend far more than they have been taking in. Now, apparently, those savings are about to run out. What's more, the GNOME Foundation has been unusually silent about their operations, not publishing any public reports for closing in on 2 years now, and their strategy to save themselves from bankruptcy, this is real, appears to center around sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. What that has to do with saving a business monetarily, I don't know, but I'm here to report on it for you. This is all very real. None of this is parody. None of this is made up. This is everything that's really happening. Now, from an April 26th, that was 3 days ago, announcement from the GNOME Foundation president, Robert McQueen. He said, quote, "As you may be aware, the GNOME Foundation has operated at a deficit, nonprofit speak for a loss, i.e. spending more than we've been raising each year for over 3 years, essentially running the foundation on reserves from some substantial donations received 4 to 5 years ago. The foundation has a reserves policy which specifies a minimum amount of money we have to keep in our accounts. This is so that if there is a significant interruption to our usual income, we can preserve our core operations while we work on new funding sources." This is the important part. We've now, quote, hit the buffers of this reserves policy, meaning the board cannot approve any more deficit budgets. To keep spending at the same level, we must increase our income. In short, GNOME has run out of money. And in order to keep spending at the same level, meaning basically paying their current staff, GNOME needs to find some money right now. Now, let's look at this. What sort of money are we talking about here? To fully understand the dire straits of the GNOME Foundation and what they find themselves in, let's take a look at what we know about their finances. Unfortunately, the GNOME Foundation has not published any data at all in close to 2 years. They have not published an annual report for 2023 last year, and their most recent IRS records only cover their fiscal year up through September of 2022. Now, we're only a few months away from the summer of 2024, which means we're almost 2 years since we've gotten any data out of the GNOME Foundation, which means we are forced to look at previous year's data and extrapolate forward based on what information we do have. Now, here's a set of data on expenditures and revenue from 2021 and 2022 from the GNOME Foundation's annual report that was supplied almost 2 years back. In short, the total expenses for the GNOME Foundation, this is what they were. In 2021, it was a little bit over $900,000, and in 2022, it reduced a bit to about $659,000. Now, the revenue for those same years was a lot lower. In 2021, we have $286,000, and in 2022, we have $363,000. Now, the important thing to notice here is that the expenses far exceed the revenue by a huge amount. That is not good. Everyone knows that is not good. It's not good for a house. It's not good for a business. It's not good for a nonprofit. If you spend more money than you take in, you got a problem. So if we subtract the expenses from the revenue, you have the net income, right? Or net losses. And boy, howdy, is it deep into the negative. Deep, 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 deep. Which means this is the amount, what follows, that they need to take out of their savings every year just to keep the lights on. In 2021, they pulled out of savings $640,000 in order to keep going. In 2022, they pulled out less. They pulled out $296,000, so just shy of $300,000. Now, we know that GNOME is burning through between, about $300,000 and $640,000 of savings per year, which begs the question, how much do they have left in terms of cash reserves? So let's look at that. Let's talk about their nest egg, shall we? The most recent information we have on the GNOME assets comes from their IRS filings up through September of 2022, which is their last publicly available filing. This is what we have here. Here's a screenshot from their IRS 990 filed in September of 2022. Now, the first thing I want to point out here is that those numbers don't really add up and are not exactly in line with the GNOME Foundation's annual report. That in and of itself is not surprising, nor is that necessarily a problem. Oftentimes for these foundations, the annual reports and the IRS filings will cover slightly different time periods and be filed at different times when different data is available, oftentimes with some of that data needing to be amended later. So the fact that they don't line up exactly, that's not an issue, right? That doesn't show anything nefarious. That doesn't show any major problems. The numbers are close enough to suggest that they just were filed at slightly different time periods and they might cover slightly different periods of time. That's okay. They're close enough that it all makes sense. We can work with this. But the important thing here is that the listed assets on that page of the IRS filing as of 2022 really don't give us enough information. It lists $909,000 as of 2022, September, in total net assets. But what we need to know is how much savings and temporary cash investments they have. Those are the key words we're looking for here. In other words, how much money can GNOME get their hands on in short notice to actively use for funding their immediate expenses, right? How much can they grab in cash to pay the bills, right? We're not looking at, various types of assets. We're looking at cash or cash equivalents, essentially. And for that, we'll need to look a few pages further down the IRS 990 form at this particular line. Savings and temporary cash investments. Boom, there we go. $765,011. So $765,000. That's how much the GNOME Foundation had in September of 22 in available savings and cash on hand. Now, how much money does GNOME have left today, right? We're near the end of April of 2024. We're almost 2 years after that at that line. And we know from the statements from the president of the GNOME Foundation that they've continued since then to be burning through savings. Well, being as we don't have a lot of that data, we're going to need to make some assumptions based on the data above. That's what we've got to go with. The GNOME Foundation is being really tight-lipped about all of this. So, assumptions. I want to be clear about this. I hate making assumptions, but we have no other choice. Considering the lack of data coming from the GNOME Foundation, what else can we do? We have to make assumptions based on the available data, based on the statements made, and based on past track record, the previous few years. I also took a quick look at what their total employee size looks like and how things may or may not have changed to try and see if spending might be in line with the 2022 levels. That's what we're going to have to do. So, assuming that things have stayed the same, right? Let's assume that. In 2023, GNOME managed to keep, let's assume, again, big assume here. Let's assume that they managed to keep their annual expenditures down to their 2022 levels, which, remember, was already way down from their 2021 levels. In 2021, what was it? They spent almost $1 million, right? They spent a lot. So they went into the hole in 2021, 640 grand. In 2022, they made it much more reasonable. They only went into the whole 300 grand. So we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. We're going to assume the best case scenario here, right? Absolute total best case scenario for the GNOME Foundation. That's what we're going to assume. And let's also assume that their income stayed steady as well, right? So therefore, they're going to be eating into their savings at the same level. We don't have much of another choice. Again, this is best case. The reality is it's probably worse than this, but we don't know. So math. Let's do some math. Savings minus the amount they need to withdraw from savings, that will give us the amount of money they have left over. So from October of 2022 through September of 2023, their fiscal year, they went from $765,000 minus $296,000, which leaves you with $468,000 and some change. Now, let's make the same assumption from that point, October of 2023, through to the present of April 2024. Have I made you go to sleep yet? We're going to do a tiny bit more math. So that's 7 months in total. Now, we know that the total amount that GNOME would need to draw from their savings every month is roughly $24,000 and some change. That's basic. So how we've got to that is the $296,000 yearly divided by 12, which, as we all know, is the number of months in a year. So thus, to get the amount of savings that they've spent over the last 7 months, we simply multiply that number by 7, all right? For which we get $172,000. So October 2023 through April of 2024, that brings us to current. $468,000 minus $172,000 equals, and this is fascinating, $296,000. Now, in theory, that's how much money they have left in savings, $296,000. Now, why is that number significant? Because that is almost exactly the amount of savings they will need to withdraw to stay afloat for 1 year based on their 2022 numbers. So that is totally in line, right? Now, remember from the announcement this week by the president of GNOME, quote, "The foundation has a reserves policy which specifies a minimum amount of money that we have to keep in our accounts." Okay. Now, could this be related to that number we came up with above? It certainly seems possible. It certainly would be reasonable to assume that the GNOME Foundation has a policy that states that if they're burning through cash, they need to have enough in savings to cover them for the next year. That seems reasonable. That's a reasonable policy. Is that their policy? We don't know. They have not provided details on that. I have asked, but they have not provided details on that. It simply is a reasonable assumption to make. But without better records and communication from the GNOME Foundation, we truly don't know for sure. We don't, right? We don't. So, if their numbers have stayed consistent since September of 2022, which is a big if, this means that the GNOME Foundation has enough funds to continue current operations through April of 2025, at which point the GNOME Foundation will need to significantly scale back their expenditures. And when I say significantly, I mean they will be forced to lay off the majority of their staff. That's 1 year from today, give or take. That's 1 year. According to all available public records and meshing with the statements made by GNOME, the few statements we have, the GNOME Foundation has 1 year left to live. That's according to the data and the statements made. Holy heavens. The biggest desktop environment in the Linux world, the one used by Red Hat and SUSE and Canonical and on, it could have just a year left to live, at least the foundation. This raises a lot of questions, a whole lot of questions. I'm going to go through some of them now, and this isn't even everything. I mean, there's just a lot here. First, what is a new executive director doing to save GNOME? And now, some of you may remember this. In October of 2023, last year, the GNOME Foundation hired a new executive director, a person whose previous job was a self-described, quote, professional shaman. Now, I need to be clear about this. This is not a religiously associated shaman. This has nothing to do with shamanism, right? This has nothing to do with the culture, the religion, none of it. None of that. This person sold shaman flavored shaman water, right? Shaman that she made in her kitchen in a thing. She showed videos about how she makes shaman water. And then she offered a paid training program to train you on how to start your own shaman business, right? To become your own professional shaman. Make of that what you will. That's what this person did before becoming the executive director of GNOME. Now, in the half year since that time, the new GNOME executive director, whose name is Holly Million, has had very little public presence. There have been no blog posts, except for one. At the very beginning, when she first joined, it was a very generic, short, I'm the new executive director blog post, and then total radio silence since then. There's been no social media activity, no major interviews, no responses to press requests at all that I'm aware of. Totally quiet. Radio silence. During the one publicly held event, which was a meet and greet, this is a real thing, this is ridiculous. They held a meet and greet with the GNOME Foundation's new executive director a few weeks after she joined the GNOME Foundation, right? I attended this. And as far as I know, everyone else was kicked out before it started, and the planned recording, they were going to record it and post it to YouTube for people who couldn't make it so they could get to know the new executive director, was canceled for unstated reasons, and it all just went away and got swept under the rug. That was the single only public event related to the executive director. And it, as far as I know, got canceled. They canceled the public recording of it. They kicked me out. They just kind of shut it down. Why? I don't know. I asked. I got no response. That's par for the course with the GNOME Foundation nowadays. They do not respond. Now, what has exactly has the GNOME executive director been doing to make sure that the GNOME Foundation does not go out of business? It's a mystery. It's total silence. In fact, one of the few indications that we have as to the direction that the GNOME Foundation is taking comes from a Twitter post by other GNOME board members, namely one Twitter post from the GNOME vice president. And I'm going to read it to you now and show you a screenshot here. Excited. I'll read you the full thing here. I'll read you the full tweet because this is the only information we have, so you might as well enjoy every word of it. It's another time of the year for an in-person board meeting, and I'm quite excited about the progressive conversation we had with the executive director, Holly Million. We engaged in extensive discussions regarding the strategic direction of GNOME, focusing on, and here's the focus, sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. The future looks green. Shamrock emoji, hashtag, I'm just going to read this last hashtag here because it's very funny to me. Hashtag technology. Okay, let's put everything else aside for a minute. Hashtag technology? Hashtag technology, guys. What? Okay, I'm sorry. I gotta move on. I'm not here to make fun. This is the GNOME Foundation board, with everyone sitting around a table. Hashtag technology. The future looks green. Shamrock emoji. All right. So that was from the GNOME vice president, Regina Nkenkor. From what little information we have, it appears that the GNOME profitability efforts are centered around sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. And hashtag technology with the shamrock emoji. That's all we've got. That's it. That's the only information, everybody. Now, you may be asking, how does that result in GNOME not going out of business? And I wish I could tell you, man. I wish I could provide you with some more details than that. I don't know. I honestly don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. But according to this week's announcement by the GNOME president, fundraising is one of the key reasons why Holly Million, the Shaman executive director, was hired away from her Shaman job, right? I'm going to read this quote here. One of the board's top priorities in hiring Holly was therefore her experience in communications and fundraising and building broader and more diverse support for our mission and work. Her goals since joining, as well as building her familiarity with the community and project, because she had no experience with GNOME or, as far as I know, Linux before, have been to set up better financial controls and reporting, develop a strategic plan, and start fundraising. I'm going to repeat a few of those bits here. Communications, fundraising, financial reporting. That is why their executive director was hired, and those were her goals since she started work at the GNOME Foundation over half a year ago. In that time, the GNOME executive director has given no interviews, been totally radio silent with no articles, social posts, podcasts, videos, nothing. Not published any financial reports of any kind. We have no clue what GNOME has been doing financially for almost 2 years now. And from what little we're being told, she has continued GNOME's death march towards running out of money. Now, those goals again, communications, fundraising, financial reporting, this sounds like a massive, unmitigated failure of all three goals. Communications, she has not communicated at all. Fundraising, she has done no fundraising at all. Financial reporting, GNOME is actually going slower on providing information publicly than before. We have no information at all. Nothing. Total failure across the board. And their plan to turn things around sounds like it centers on sustainability, diversity, and inclusion, which is not exactly a strong business plan. Whatever you think of those words doesn't matter. That's not a business plan. That's not a fundraising plan. So what happens now? Well, it sounds like things are getting desperate, right? From what information we have, it doesn't sound good. And the GNOME Foundation will be announcing their plans to save the GNOME Foundation in the weeks ahead. Quote, this is from, again, the president of the GNOME Foundation. Also, not the executive director. The executive director has not made any statement whatsoever on any of this. As far as I know, she's not involved in any of this other than sitting around a table and saying shamrock emoji. I don't know. The biggest prerequisite for fundraising is a clear strategy. Okay. We need to explain what we're doing and why it's important, and use that to convince people to support our plans. I'm very pleased to report that Holly has been working hard on this and meeting with many stakeholders across the community and has prepared a detailed and insightful 5-year strategic plan. Well, that bodes well. The plan defines the areas where the foundation will prioritize, develop, and fund initiatives to support and grow the GNOME project and community. The board has approved a draft version of this plan, and over the coming weeks, Holly and the foundation team will be sharing this plan and running a consultation process to gather feedback input from GNOME Foundation and community members. Okay, so what is that plan? How likely is that plan to succeed in bringing in enough funding to keep the foundation afloat? At this point, we simply don't know. The GNOME Foundation and their executive director, they're staying tight-lipped and super duper secretive. The only thing we know at all is that they haven't done anything so far. Nothing. Nada. The last 6 months have been nothing. And that their plan includes sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. That's it. Now, wait a minute. Right about now, you might be remembering something. What was that thing? There was a news report last year that the GNOME Foundation announced that they would be receiving €1 million from the Sovereign Tech Fund. You remember this? This was big news. And the way it was worded at the time sounded like this was a big bit of financing for the GNOME Foundation. Well, it sounds like those funds aren't for the foundation at all, but for specific development purposes and can't be used for the foundation. Quote, This money is received in the form of a contract for services rather than a grant to the foundation and must be spent on the development areas agreed during the planning and application process. It's included within this year's budget, October 23rd through September 24th. See, that's their financial year. And is all expected to be spent during this fiscal year, so it does not have an impact on the foundation's reserves position. In other words, that €1,000,000, it won't be beefing up their savings account. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant for all of this. Now, a lot of you might also be asking, where's Red Hat? Where's SUSE? Where's Canonical? Where's those big companies, right? They rely on GNOME because these are some of the biggest Linux companies on earth. And they use the GNOME desktop environment for all of their product line, right? They make millions and millions and millions of buckazoids directly from GNOME. Where are they? This is worth considering. Why haven't they? Why haven't Red Hat or SUSE or Canonical stepped up to provide the needed funding for the foundation which supports their default desktop environment, their user experience? Where are they? Maybe they can't do it. Maybe they're in a position where they can't afford to do it. I don't know. Maybe they don't want to do it. That's something worth considering, and it's an interesting thought. What if Red Hat doesn't want, for whatever reason, to spend what would essentially to them be pennies to support the GNOME Foundation? Why would that be? It's worth thinking about. And the reason for the lack of funding is entirely unknown. Let's be clear. We can hypothesize. We can speculate all we want, but we really don't know. Just the same, I think it's worth asking. I think it's worth asking that question. And for that matter, where in the heck is the Linux Foundation? This seems like exactly the sort of thing a Linux quote-unquote foundation with over $250 million in annual revenue could do to help, Linux. But it's not. This is not, they're not at all. So where are they? Again, do they not want to? Are their hands tied somehow? Do they not want to? Why is nobody swooping in to help the GNOME Foundation? It makes my eyes get all squinty and my eyebrow go up and all sorts of weird gears start turning in my head. I don't have any inside information here to share with you on this. But you better believe I've sent a lot of emails about it because I'm skeptical. Something's up here. Now, I want to point something out. This is not the first time that the GNOME Foundation has had money problems. Are they poised to run out of money now? Yeah, it looks like they are. And the GNOME Foundation leadership is obviously very concerned. They're putting a freeze on deficit spending and all sorts of stuff. I mean, this is a big deal. But this, again, it's not the first time they've had money trouble. Back in 2014, 10 years ago, there were serious public concerns about the financial state of the GNOME Foundation, so much so that, again, 10 years ago, they put a spending freeze in place, right? Now, that was a big deal, but GNOME survived that. The GNOME Foundation survived their 2014 financial apocalypse, right? It wasn't as bad as this one, but they made it through. And just as easily, the GNOME Foundation could certainly survive this new, let's just call it a little financial dip. But the actions of the GNOME Foundation raised some serious concerns and doubts that will have a happy ending this time. And I want to read a couple of questions to you because these are just some of the questions I have. Why is the GNOME Foundation staying so secretive? They've published no plans. I know they've said they will publish plans, but they haven't so far. No communication at all from their executive director. And no published recent reports. Nothing. We have nothing to go on here. Why? It's worth asking. At this point, we should have gotten some additional information, but we haven't. Why? The only known details of their secret plan, their super top secret plan to avert a shutdown, they're not even dropping breadcrumbs here. This is the only bit we know, is that it involves sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. That can't be real, can it? Like, no serious software foundation would stare into the abyss, be looking at a train heading straight for their face of possible bankruptcy, and then they make sustainability, diversity, and inclusion a significant part of their strategy to not get hit by the bankruptcy train. No serious executive director would do that. No serious business person would do that. No serious financial organization, no serious software foundation. None of them would ever do that. Not ever. I mean, you can't be serious and make that how you're going to keep from dying, right? Because we're not talking about them being in a good position so now they can take on social justice causes. No, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about how do they keep the lights on and pay their employees. Well, they know they're not going to be able to, possibly starting right away. So they're going to have some sustainability and diversity, a little bit of inclusion. Oh, now we've got $1 bazillion. That doesn't work that way. They know that. So what? Is that a joke? Is that a pipe dream of a random board member? We need to know these things. This came from the vice president of the board for the GNOME Foundation. And it's the only tidbit we have. How utterly bizarre. What has the executive director, Holly Million, been doing for the last half of a year? Why hasn't there been any noteworthy fundraising or sponsorships? If there were, we would have heard about them. Whenever big fundraising comes into the GNOME Foundation, they sing it from the top of the mountains. I mean, heck, that €1 million that apparently can't even go to the foundation bankrolls, they were like super jazzed to tell everyone about that. And clearly, they're saying they're running out of money. So why hasn't there been any fundraising? Supposedly, the new executive director is great at fundraising. Why is that? Now, really think about this for a moment. Considering GNOME's unique place in the Linux and open source world, funding GNOME should not be an issue for anyone even slightly familiar with fundraising and the Linux corporate world. Has the GNOME executive director sat down face to face with leadership from Red Hat and Canonical and SUSE and the Linux Foundation and shoot, even Microsoft? What have they not done this? Well, I want to know. I legitimately want to know. Has this happened? Has the executive director done this? Because if you gave me 6 months, the GNOME Foundation would have enough funding. The GNOME Foundation is GNOME, for heaven's sake. It is used so heavily by companies that make billions of dollars. We're not talking about billions of dollars. We're not even talking millions of dollars. We're talking about pennies compared to what is made off of GNOME. The finances are available if people are doing their jobs. So what has the executive director been doing? And then last, I also want to ask this. Why have the large Linux and open source companies, and the Linux Foundation included, not gotten involved? What is going on here? Is there a conflict of some kind we're unaware of? Do they want the GNOME Foundation to not succeed? I mean, if that's possible, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. It doesn't make any sense to me. If the GNOME Foundation board and the executive director were worth anything, they would already, I mean, if they were doing the bare minimum of their jobs, bare minimum, they would have already gone to all of those companies we just talked about, the Linux Foundation and more, with their hat in hand, and talked about ways they can cooperate together more, ways they can get more funding, etc. That would already be happening. So we can either assume two things have happened. Either one, the GNOME Foundation and executive director have done nothing at all except sit around a boardroom and talk about diversity and inclusion, which is possible. In which case, they're not worth their grain of salt and they should be tossed out on their keister because they're driving the entire GNOME Foundation into the ground. Or they have gone to these companies, they have done their job, and these companies have said no. which calls into question a lot, a whole lot, and I'm not even sure what all that means yet. Now, in the coming weeks, the GNOME Foundation has said that they will announce details of their super top secret, definitely going to work plan to keep the foundation alive. And for what it's worth, I want to be very clear about this. The Lunduke Journal is rooting for them. I may be coming out here with a lot of criticism, but I am rooting for the GNOME Foundation and their secret plan. Whatever it may be, I truly do hope it succeeds. You'll note when you look through my coverage of GNOME, it is all over the map. I have praised them when they have deserved praise. I've even talked in years past about how great their annual reports are. Go back and look that one up, where I've talked about how they should be, what they've done in the past for their reporting should be a model for what some other open source organizations should be doing. That's clearly not the case now, so I'm criticizing them. When they do bad, I criticize them. When they do good, I praise them. I'm going to be honest every step of the way. No matter what my personal feelings about GNOME are, I'm going to be honest about it. Now, a lot of people are going to see this little short video I've recorded and the article I've put out here as being extremely negative towards the GNOME Foundation. They're going to point to it, and that people are going to call me names because of it. Undoubtedly, that always happens when I criticize the GNOME Foundation. Always, every single time. In fact, oftentimes I get called horrible names simply by talking about my thoughts relating to the GNOME Foundation leadership. Just simply reporting on it. But despite all of that, I truly hope the GNOME Foundation pulls this together. I want them to stay afloat. I want them to stay in business, and I want to see them succeed. So I'm rooting for you. The GNOME Foundation, I want you to win this one. But considering the bad financials and all of the other reasons I outlined here, I remain less than optimistic, to say the least. I should also note that I have reached out to the GNOME Foundation, to board members individually, to them as a collective group, both privately and publicly. I've even tweeted at them. I've received no response from them whatsoever. That is not new. I've reached out to the GNOME Foundation. I've reached out to their executive director directly so many times now, and there has been nothing. Absolutely nothing. As usual, the GNOME Foundation is going radio silence, not providing any information to the public, not providing annual reports, not providing financial data, not providing what they plan to do to keep their foundation afloat. But we know that it's tanking. That's all we know. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Once again, thank you to all of the Lunduke Journal supporters and subscribers. You make all of the work that we do here possible. We take no advertising revenue, no sponsorship revenue from any company, which means that the Lunduke Journal is one of the few tech journalism outlets out there that can actually speak truth to power. We're the only ones that can actually tell you the truth without fear of making our advertisers grumpy. No one can cancel us. No one can take our funding away except for you. You guys keep us afloat. So thank you to everyone who supports us. If you go to lunduke.com, you'll see a lot of different ways you can follow the Lunduke Journal there. You can see a number of the past articles, not all of them. If you want all of them, you got to become a subscriber, but a good chunk to get you started on the historical articles and some of the more breaking news and investigative journalism pieces that we publish here at the Lunduke Journal. And if you go to lunduke.locals.com, lunduke.locals.com, you'll get the main site for the Lunduke Journal. It is a community site where you can post and comment on whatever you like, nerdy stuff. And that's also where you can get the shows without any ads. You can get the articles. You can get everything that I post all there with no algorithms, with no trolls, with no big tech of any kind. There's no way that IBM or Red Hat or Microsoft can have any influence over any of the content that's there. It's truly fantastic. I mean, I guess they could become a an individual paid subscriber just like all of you, but they're just one random person at that point. It's phenomenal. It's a great way to do things. And I thank you, all of you, for making it possible. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, seriously, yet another thing that you're not going to read or hear anywhere else but at the Lunduke Journal, going over all of these details. If anyone else starts covering this over the next couple of days, I guarantee you they're not going to go into as much detail as you got here, and they're probably going to skip a couple of these things. They probably are, because they're going to be afraid of what sponsors are going to do or what foundations are going to yell at them. The journalists out there are afraid. All the tech journalists, they live in fear. I don't live in fear. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.